You're listening to the Happy Doc Student Podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing clarity to the often mysterious doctoral process. Do you feel like you're losing your mind? Let me and my guests show you how to put more joy in your journey and graduate with your sanity, health, and relationships intact. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Frederick, and today I welcome William Wadsworth. William is a memory and productivity psychologist who helps scholars study smarter so they can ace their academics with less stress. His expertise has been widely featured, from a regular column in the Times to numerous high-profile education industry conferences. He also hosts the award-nominated Exam Study Expert podcast and blog, which help over 1 million readers and listeners accomplish their academic dreams. William, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Heather. I've been looking forward to this. Gosh, that guy in the intro sounds good, doesn't he? I should have him on.
It's always fun to have someone else talk about you and all your accomplishments. You've done so much, William, in terms of helping students really thrive. And I was wondering if we could spend just a few minutes here at the start with you introducing yourself to the audience by talking about how it is that you became interested in doing what you do.
Yeah. So I was a fairly unusual teen in many ways at high school. Growing up, I worked pretty hard at my studies. I imagine the same might be true of quite a few of your listeners as well, if they've ended up there. And it really wasn't until my kind of deep into reading a psychology course, as I was went to Cambridge University here in the UK, and there was one lecture I remember sort of tucked away deep towards the end of my second year that described a little bit of the science of how memory works and how we can take advantage of that to learn more effectively. And I just thought, well, this is crazy that I'm only learning about actually how we learn and how to learn more effectively now. I mean, I've been working my socks off for years, 6 years, taking kind of the major public exams in the UK and, for early years of university. And now you're telling me what I should be doing to be effective. And so I just thought, well, this is such powerful knowledge, and we need to do more to get it out into the hands of students and scholars that need it most. A lot of my work is about that bit of kind of learning and memory. That's sort of where I started. But then that's kind of taken me into this world of, all the other things that go with effective learning and effective scholarship generally. So effective time management, productivity, problem solving, all sorts of things that are no doubt relevant to your listeners taking their doctoral programs.
William, there's so many things we could talk about that would be relevant to this audience, truly. But I kind of like to go with what's happening for me and some of the listeners that have reached out to me. And just last night, the conversation of procrastination came up. And you've got some interesting things to say about procrastination as it relates to cognitive load theory. And I was wondering if we could start there.
Right. So, a little bit of a cognitive load theory 101. So, the way the brain works in terms of thinking and learning and problem solving is there's kind of two systems in the brain that work together. So you've got working memory and long-term memory. And those two things work together. And most of the time when we talk about thinking, problem solving, learning, remembering, it's those two systems that are doing the heavy lifting. So the kind of the basic cognitive architecture, working memory is the sort of short-term store of whatever you're kind of thinking about in this moment right now. So that's both the gateway to learning new things. Anytime you're learning new things, reading words off a page or listening to words that someone is telling you on a podcast, information is heading into working memory. And in order to learn it, we need to get that information to consolidate and pass through into long-term memory, where it sort of sticks for the long term. Working memory is very limited in capacity, and short-term information only stays there for a few seconds. Long-term memory, huge capacity, and information can stay there for hours, days, weeks, a whole lifetime. Cognitive load theory is all about the working memory bit. So working memory is both, as I said, the gateway to learning new things. That's where information passes through before you can learn it in the first place. And it also is where, if you're remembering something, if you're recalling something you've learned previously, that's where information is recalled back into. So it's kind of whatever you're thinking about right now. So if you're solving a problem, if you're solving 482 plus 796, it's working memory that's remembering all the little digits that you're carrying over and kind of doing the calculations. And it's the limits of working memory that make it much easier to calculate 4 plus 6, because you don't have too much to process in working memory, and much harder to calculate 492 plus 762. So working memory is limited. In the classical psychology literature, there's this idea of magic number 7 plus or minus 2. That's sort of been revised a few times, and different people have come up with different numbers. Personally, I don't really believe there's a magic number that is sort of the number of slots in working memory, the number of numbers or like units of information you can remember. I'm not sure it's as simple as that, but it's certainly true that it's limited in how much we can get into working memory. An analogy for what working memory is doing is a bit like RAM in a computer. If you know how a computer works, working memory is like the RAM in a computer. It's what's processing what the computer is thinking about right now. And in a very similar way, RAM in a computer is limited in how much you can get into it at once. Particularly on an older machine, if you open up too many browser tabs all at once, the computer goes, no thanks, and you crashes and you get the classic blue screen of death, which I'm sure many of you will remember, even if you haven't seen it so much recently on our kind of more modern machines. So cognitive load theory says working memory is limited, and if we try and put too much in working memory at once, and we call that being overloading working memory. Nobody goes around saying, oh gosh, help me, my working memory is overloaded. We go around saying, I'm confused, or I'm stuck, or I don't understand, or it doesn't make sense. Those are the words, the labels we give to being, most of the time, cognitively overloaded. Those are the labels we give to those symptoms. So, quite a bit of theory. Let me just pause. Any sort of questions on anything so far?
That was a great refresher for those who have learned this before, or a primer for those who haven't heard of it. But I love this idea of we use these labels, these words that you will hear all day long in academics when someone's trying to learn something new that's challenging. I'm overwhelmed, I'm confused, I'm stuck, I'm frustrated. And the idea that really the root cause is that you're cognitively overloaded. So what I'm wondering is if you're going to give us some tips to, now that we can recognize this and be self-aware, how can we take that information and turn it around?
Yeah. So psychologists kind of recognize 3 different, types of data, if you like, that you'd be holding in your working memory. We talk about extraneous load, intrinsic load, and germane load. So extraneous load, as the name sort of hints, is kind of unnecessary, extraneous, non-critical. So distraction-related thoughts, anything that's going on in your mind that's not related to the task you're working on, that would be extraneous load. So our job with extraneous load is to reduce the impact of the distractions, whatever's weighing on extraneous load. So minimize the amount of working memory that's going on the extraneous stuff. With intrinsic load, that's what's focused on the task, the core task in hand. So we want to sort of optimize our use of the limited working memory capacity that's kind of being put on the task itself. We can talk about that. And then germane load is sort of anything that's left over is sort of what's going into us kind of being able to come up with good insights and kind of create, join the dots and come up with flashes of, oh yeah, got it, brilliant, makes sense. So that's what's going on in germane load. So I think often when you mentioned the bit about procrastination, psychologists have studied this. So Dr. Tim Peichel in particular has done a lot of research on the science of procrastination. And his research shows there's some very identifiable characteristics of tasks that make us more likely to procrastinate on them. So they're tasks that are large, unstructured, challenging, kind of long-term rather than short-term. So all these kind of characteristics of tasks that make us more likely to procrastinate on them. I mean, you think about the things that you procrastinate on in your own life, like it tends to be those kind of big, hairy, I don't really enjoy this kind of task. So one of the ways we can tackle this, I think, links back up to all the cognitive load theory stuff we've been talking about. So if we're trying to take on a task and it's going to be very likely to overload or overwhelm, then that task is more likely to be a task we procrastinate on. So what can we do about it? Well, this is about the optimizing the intrinsic load, optimizing how you use your limited resources to tackle the task in hand. So the solution's simple in a phrase. It's to break it up, break up that task into smaller components. Now, I've been teaching this for years. I've been teaching, you're procrastinating on something. Okay, let's start to break it up. Let's break it up into the baby steps. So I've been teaching that as a strategy for years. And in parallel with that, I'd also been procrastinating on writing my slides. I do a lot of workshops. I write a lot of slides for it. And I always procrastinate on writing my slides, which is weird because I actually quite enjoy it when I get into it. So it's not that I don't enjoy the task. It's just I procrastinate on it, put it off. And then I thought, gosh, this is ridiculous. Like, I've been teaching this strategy about break it up as one of the key tactics for overcoming procrastination for years. Come on, let's start to apply my own strategies. So I started by just brainstorming on paper in rough, here are all the things I want to say. Then I'd move into, in my case, Excel. I quite like that because I can sort of shuffle things around. I'd sort of type up the main points, and then move stuff around, figure out the structure, figure out the flow, figure out the story. And then once I'd done that, I would go into PowerPoint and I would open a blank PowerPoint and I'd label each slide. I'd write the title of each slide and then write a little note to myself about what I wanted to put on each slide. And then I'd go through and then slide by slide, I would fill in the slide. And that was in many ways, I think, a way of kind of overcoming this sort of cognitive load issue. And because if I'd gone straight to writing the slides, as perhaps I used to do, I'm not only having to think about what's the content of the slide I'm writing right now, how am I going to lay this out, how am I going to land this point, what images am I going to use, how am I going to represent this, all that stuff. I'm also thinking about, I've also got in the back of my mind, okay, where am I in my overall story? Maybe my mind's still cluttered a little bit with thinking about, okay, what are some of the points I want to say later? How am I doing in my flow? Does this fit into the story in the right place? So I'm trying to think about loads of stuff all at once. And that's why it's a hard task and that's why you get overwhelmed. Whereas if you can break it up into those little pieces, you can apply your full cognitive power to one little bit of the task in turn, and it makes it much easier. I'll give you one final example. Email. So I don't know about you, but if I've got a difficult email to write, I put it off. My magic solution to this has been to go through a similar process with email. So if there's an email I'm procrastinating on, it's a difficult conversation I need to have with someone, perhaps. Sure, you know the feeling. I'll, again, brainstorm in rough, grab a sheet of paper, so brainstorm some of the points I want to make, free form, any order, whatever. I'll figure out those points. Maybe some of the points I don't end up including. Then I'll figure out the story, the structure, the flow, what order to bring up the points in, and then I'll write up the sentences and paragraphs. And breaking it up like that just makes it much, much easier because, again, apply your full cognitive power to each step in turn just makes the whole thing much less daunting, much less likely to procrastinate on it.
William, I really appreciate that you gave very specific examples because it's one thing theoretically to say, well, just break up the task. And then it's another thing to see, but practically, how do I do that? I have to write a dissertation or doctoral project. I'm going to be turning in this thing that's 100+ pages. That's going to take me 1 to 3 years to write. Where do I get started? And students will say to me, I almost feel like I'm a deer in the headlights. I'm just paralyzed. I'm frozen by the task ahead of me. And the research, I love that you brought that up. Basically, all the characteristics of a task you're going to procrastinate on is how you could describe a capstone project for a doctoral degree, right? So all of those things set you up to procrastinate. And these steps, so many of my guests will come on and share something where we can say, this sounds really simple. And I think sometimes there's resistance when something seems so simple. It's like, no, I'm in a doctoral program. I'm working on a dissertation. The solution to getting this done cannot be that simple. I challenge you, listener, just try it and see what happens. Because just last night when I was speaking with a student, he was saying, I've got this literature review to write and I don't even know where to start. But could you say, hey, this week I'm going to find 5 articles. And then next week I'm going to read them and summarize them and give myself some time to process them. And so you have this sequence of events that's very logical. And what I have found is once you get started, your motivation goes up because you've started the task versus feeling like,
oh my gosh, I got to get this started. I got to get this started. And then you're feeling bad about yourself. I'm a procrastinator. Can I do this? The whole imposter syndrome thing starts to rear its ugly head. So I love thinking about this in terms of steps, but also having those labels of, I need to really make sure I've got space. If we've got the 3 buckets, when we're talking about our memory and how we're learning, what can I do about limiting distractions? Because people will say, your house will never be cleaner than when you're working on your dissertation, because you will do anything but, right? Oh, I need to do the dishes. I should be doing the laundry. How to manage distractions. Is that topic something that you talk about a lot when you talk about procrastination?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess for me, like procrastination is putting off getting started, and then distraction is what happens once you've started. And that's sort of like, your brain thinking about other things at the same time, or your attention sort of switching to other things. And that takes away from the core task once you've actually got it underway. And yeah, you're right. This is an incredibly important thing to think about, particularly in the modern world when we're surrounded by so much technology in particular. Our brains have probably never been more distracted or distractible. So it's an important thing to think about. We can divide distractions into external and internal distractions. So external distractions are those things from, with the outside world happening, outside your brain. So technology is often the biggest one. So your phone pinging, email notification, other humans, other people around you. That can be a big one. So I guess the thought here is, or like perhaps doing a little bit of an audit. What are the things that distract you? What are the things that are pulling your attention away from your core task? And what can you do about them? And I mean, in many cases, the answers are quite basic. But asking yourself, like, am I actually doing this? And again, like I've been teaching this for years, but I only did an exercise a couple of weeks ago where I actually opened the notifications section of my phone and reviewed and audited, okay, what notifications do I actually have on? And I thought I had all my notifications turned off. I hadn't. There was still like the screen time one, and I had a bunch of ones that were still on because they only popped up maybe once a week. I kind of hadn't really registered that they were an issue. So I have everything off, even the red splodges, on the WhatsApp or whatever, when you get the red splodge that says inbound message, like I'd have that off as well. I will go in and check those things on my own terms when I've got time. And batch them in a chunk. Same with email. Like I don't have any way of inbound email reaching me at the moment it's sent. Like I go and check my email at dedicated prearranged times each day on my terms. I don't let it crowd out my mental capacity the rest of the time. Because it's not just the moment of distraction when the message comes in. It's also then it's been called cognitive residue. I'm not sure how much science there is behind that, but it's certainly true that, when something comes in, when a message pops in or you hear your phone go bing, even if you don't look at what it is, your mind starts to ruminate. Oh, I wonder what that message could be. Or, maybe it's so-and-so, or, oh gosh, like I wonder if that's so-and-so replying to me. That takes valuable cognitive bandwidth away from the task in hand. So get it all off, turn it all off. You don't need any of it. External distractions could be trickier. That might be about thinking about location. Some people use headphones as a social signal that, okay, I'm not to be disturbed now. Music itself is an interesting one in the sense that the right sounds, the right music can be a way to block out some of those external distractions. But music in itself can be distracting. I mean, if you pick the wrong songs and you end up sort of singing along, well, it's taking attention away from your core task as well. So being conscious of the music you're choosing. The other super prestigious university in the UK is the Oxford University, of course, and the main library there is the Bodleian Library. If you Google sounds of the Bodleian, you get a nice website with library soundscapes that were recorded in the Bodleian. It's the sound of a silent library. And
really,
my wife loves to work to that. That's just her jam, and might be a good fit for some of you as well. So yeah, there's various ways of managing both your internal and external distractions. The final one I'd mention when it comes to sort of extraneous load, and this is a big one for a lot of your listeners, is thinking about what we need to do next, thinking about our to-do list, our goals, our plans. The brain is for having ideas, not for holding them. Classic David Allen quote. So we want to be externalizing our to-do lists, our plans as much as possible. Don't let those float around in your brain, soaking up mental bandwidth. Get it out, get it onto paper, get it into a digital system. I'm sure things you've talked about on the show in the past. Use all those strategies, but don't let them clog up your brain. One specific one on this is, if you're doing a task, you're doing some research or some reading, and a question pops into your mind, I should do more on that, or I need to go and check that, or I need to speak to somebody, or any of those little tangents. Some of my clients find it quite supportive to keep a tangents list as they're going. So it's things that you don't kind of indulge the rabbit hole right there and then, but you review that list at the end of the day, every few days, whatever works for you. And then you make a decision at that point. Okay, well, these are the rabbit holes or the further investigations I want to go down. These are the ones. Okay, maybe I can deprioritize those. And that just allows you to keep making progress on that core task whilst also saving those kind of insights and ideas and capturing them for later without them kind of, again, your brain churning away and that clogging up your attention. So various ideas there to help you maximize your extraneous load.
So many nuggets there. I love this. The mind is for having ideas, not holding them. You're right. I do have some episodes on this. Some people prefer the old school. I've got my paper to-do list. I recently transitioned to a digital app called Remember the Milk. And once I know it's on there, then it frees me up. I'm like, I know it's there. I don't need to think about it now. And you give yourself permission to let it go. Right. So I will have links in the show notes to some of the episodes if you're like, I really need to get my to-do list under control and get it out of my mind and put it somewhere else. I cannot wait to get from you this link to the library sounds.
I'll pop that over to you. Yes, no problem.
Because that is cool.
Sounds of the Bodleian.
Yeah. And I have had students say, cannot listen to anything. It needs to be perfectly silent. The headset idea where it's a physical cue too. For you and everyone in your family, I'm working, I want it completely silent. But then I have other students who say, I use certain playlists and it gets me into my jam, it gets me into my flow. I wrote my dissertation to an Edith Piaf CD that is forever memorialized in my brain because I probably listened to it thousands of times. But listeners, this is a personal decision. You know what works for you. But these are things that can have a large cumulative effect in terms of you being laser focused. And man, if there is ever a time you need to be laser focused, it's when you're working on your doctoral courses, your research. You need to figure out a way to set those distractions aside. And the technology is a huge one. When I've done workshops where students will actually track how much time they're spending on things, the number one thing they say is, I had no idea. I had no idea. I mean, pick your poison. TikTok, Netflix, scrolling through Facebook. It is a rabbit hole that you go down. And I will say, hey, this is a huge life goal that you have that you're working on. What about maybe removing them from your phone, going inactive until you finish this goal? Trust me, it's going to be there when you get back, right? Let your friends and family know if there's something super important. Why don't you just call me? I'm not going to be on Facebook. For me, binge watching is one of kind of my guilty pleasures. When I'm working on a big project, like when I was writing the Happy Doc Student Handbook, I had to stop my subscription so that the temptation wasn't there. It wasn't enough for me to say, I'm only going to let myself watch one episode or only on the weekends. I actually had to cancel my subscription. So listeners, big task at hand. Your human mind is beautiful, brilliant, can do lots of things, but it has its limits. William, it has its limits, and we need to respect those limits and work around them. Okay, we've covered extraneous and we've covered intrinsic. That leaves germane.
So that's the third bit of working memory. So quick thought on this. That's where you kind of have your insights and those bursts of creativity that I imagine are very, quite important to many of you, particularly if you're trying to do new research in an area. Think about where you are when you have your best ideas and your best insights. For many people, that's not while they're sitting hunched over their books, concentrating their mind. It's actually in the other spaces, when they're out on a walk, when they're in the shower. And so kind of leaning into that and being quite intentional about that. Don't listen to a podcast in the shower if that's where you, listening to podcasts is great. You should listen to podcasts, particularly the current one, of course. If you have great ideas in the shower, just give your brain a little bit of space and time to have those great ideas. Don't kind of clog it up with a podcast if that's one of your core sources of insight and inspiration. So that was one thought on the germane load and just having those kind of flashes of creativity.
You have given so many helpful tips for getting people going on a large, unstructured, time-consuming, cognitively difficult task. Before we go, though, I wanted to ask if you had a favorite quote or some final words of wisdom you want to leave with the audience.
So the other thought I wanted to leave people with is on kind of the other bit I spent a lot of my life teaching about, which is how to get stuff into long-term memory, how to learn things in the first place. And to kind of distill down a big subject just into kind of a couple of moments, the key is the combination of retrieval practice and spaced learning. Retrieval practice means testing yourself, pulling knowledge out of memory. Spaced learning is repeating that process multiple times with a time delay in between. So classic ways to do retrieval practice: pull that knowledge out of memory, test yourself, things like flashcards, paper flashcards, digital flashcards. That's how it works really well. You guys have lots to learn. The key is that combination of retrieval practice and spaced learning. Ask yourself, how much of your study time are you spending pulling knowledge out of memory as opposed to pushing it in, and aim to maximize that.
I want to make sure that the listeners know how to get a hold of you and get a hold of some of the amazing resources that you have on your website. I will have the links in the show notes below, but do you want to talk a little bit about the free download that you have on your website?
Yeah. So if you want to kind of get a nice little one-page summary of some of my favorite tips and tricks for studying smarter, particularly if you're faced with an exam, but many of the tips are relevant to any form of scholarship, research, academia. Head to examstudyexpert.com/pillars, as in it's the 6 pillars of student success. So examstudyexpert.com/pillars, PILLARS. If you're interested, in podcasts about sort of doing well in your PhDs, I also run a podcast, and we've had a couple of episodes ourselves touching on this subject. And then finally, I thought I'd just mention a program I have. It's called The Scholar's Way, which is a really nice kind of 30-day mindset and productivity program, which I think is relevant for all scholars. And there's a lot in there that I think is very, very relevant to students pursuing doctoral programs. Things like, managing your time, becoming imposter syndrome. Each day there's a little daily mindset or kind of productivity, like little bite-sized lesson and a kind of mini activity or challenge to do. And it kind of builds through the 30 days, little sort of 5-10 minute bit of learning each day. And it's a really, really fun process to go through. And everybody leaves it with some nice takeaways to kind of apply to their life going forward and find more fun and flow in their studies. So I'll give you the link to that, and we can put that in the show notes as well, perhaps, if people want to take a look at that.
And, a 30-day course, sometimes that's exactly what you need. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, this was great information, but I need accountability. I need someone there sending me something every day so I can get out of this rut that I'm in and just start moving forward in my program. I will definitely have that link below, William. And for your podcast, if you want to send me the specific links to the ones that talked about doctoral programs, I'll link those below. But I know I've got a lot of listeners who are educators. So you are going to want to check out William's podcast so that you can be more effective in the classroom and help your students as well. William, thanks for coming on the show and sharing all those tips with my listeners.
It's been huge fun. Thanks ever so much for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. Until then, if you're looking for more ways to invite joy in your journey, check out the free resources at expandyourhappy.com. You'll find downloads like an article I wrote titled The Doctoral Journey, 12 Things You Need to Know That They Probably Won't Tell You. You'll also find a PDF that organizes all podcasts by the 7 steps detailed in the Happy Doc Student Handbook, which you can also find on the website. Finally, if you're looking for a Happy Doc student swag, I've got that too. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and YouTube channel, and if you want to make my day, rate and review so that together we can change the way doctoral education is delivered and experienced. Hey, one more thing. Just a quick reminder that the information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only.